السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
جزاكم الله خير, brother Imran. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So it was a pleasure to come back to Rochdale. It's a special mosque for many reasons. I was here last year in the snow, and some of the brothers had to sort of give me a hand to actually get into the mosque with the car. That is, I was able to walk in, but the car wasn't able to come close enough. But also because there's always some sort of high-tech stuff going on in this mosque, from the posters which are on the walls, which are beautifully decorated and innovative, to all the equipment that you see about. It's not very often that you go to Islamic centers which are so prepared when it comes to technology. And all praises and thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has blessed this mosque with so many of our brothers and sisters who have such capability. It's also a special mosque in that there are so many activities for sisters, for women in this mosque, which is unlike many centers. And it's good to see at least one mosque, standing up and doing so much for our sisters who are in many regards, taking the forefront when it comes to many areas of Islamic work. So inshallah, it's a pleasure to be here, and today inshallah to cover this aspect of the seerah, the life history of the Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I know that you've already started to study particular aspects. It's very difficult in the 4 sessions to cover the entire life history of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the idea is that hopefully we can give a sense of flavor in terms of what to expect when you do intend to study the Prophet, and hopefully to inspire you as well to be able to learn about his life. We call ourselves Muslims, and we declared, and by doing so we have declared the Shahada. The Shahada which says, La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So we know that at least half of the Shahada which we have recited has to do with Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam as Rasulullah. So it's imperative really for us, whether we are young, whether we are old, whether we are among the elderly, for us to really learn more about his life and to study his life in some detail. So inshallah, so these are some of the things that before we actually go into the period that we're going to consider, I know that you've covered more or less until the age when the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was more or less until the age of 12 last week. But I just want to, before we embark on our journey, trying to understand a little bit more about his life, to think about certain things. Now, when we read the Quran, one of the remarkable things about the Quran is that the Quran also, in a sense, is a historical account. It's a historical account of creation. It's a historical account of humanity. Humanity from the very beginning until, inshallah, until the end. And even beyond that, into the next world. But one of the remarkable things about the Quran is that the Quran is able to transcend time and space, in the sense that it has a message which is applicable to all people and to all times. So one cannot, even though you may be living in the 21st century, you can't say, well, the Quran is not applicable to you, because the way the message has been laid out in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is something, the more you read, it has something for each one of us. For each one of us, despite where we live. We might be living in a remote area, we might be living in a high-tech society, but the Quran certainly has a message, something that can connect with each person. So you may be poor, you might be rich, the Quran can still connect with you. And that's the beauty of the Quran. You don't have to be an intellectual. You don't have to be scholarly. You don't have to know everything about the deen to be able to draw lessons and to be able to draw guidance from the Quran. In a similar way, when we look at the seerah or the life history of the Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it can be studied in different ways. Okay? It can be studied in different ways. Now, there are some people who, when they look at the seerah, they look at it purely as the words which are there. Maybe the sayings of the Prophet. Maybe they want to become more in tune with the way he dressed, the way he behaved, the way he lived, the way he did particular type of practices. So we need to be careful about what we consider to be the seerah firstly. And the second thing is about how do we study it. And how do we study it is important about the type of lessons that we draw from it. What I mean by that is that somebody can study the Quran from a purely intellectual point of view in terms of trying to understand particular type of philosophy or particular type of traits that he may have, characteristics, maybe his way from the morning to the evening, the way he spent his life over a 24-hour period, all sorts of things you can do. There are different ways in which it can be studied. So these are the things that we need to look at. And the third thing is that, what do we do with it? So you've studied the seerah, you've managed to read books, you've managed to look at his life in fine detail. Then what do you do with the information in which you have acquired? And this is the same. We are looking at the life of the Prophet for 4 weeks. The question remains, what are we going to do with this information that we acquire? The information that we gain today, the information after we have read the book on the life of the Prophet, the information that we will gain in the forthcoming weeks, inshallah. This is the important thing for us. If it is that we can appreciate how the methodology which should be adopted in studying the seerah, then we will be able to draw even more from it in terms of trying to appreciate what it is meant to do. Now, in a sense, one of the unfortunate things about many books which have been written about the life history of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, going back to the original books, is that they were written from a point of view of a historical account. And more so, most of the books you would note have been written from the point of view of battles. Okay? So most books on seerah, if you read the books of Ibn Ishaq, or some of the early authors who were able to document the life history of the Prophet, it had to do with battles. So you talk about the period before Prophethood, and perhaps one of the battles might be mentioned, the hijrah, the Fujar wars. Then we look at the Battle of Uhud, and the Battle of Badr, and the Battle of Hunayn, and the Battle of all the different battles which are there. So they're studied from the point of view of battles which have taken place. And these are the way the books of seerah are. We will be looking at, in this session, I am not going to be looking at battles per se. Because I think in the seerah, there is a much deeper message rather than just pure warfare. And there is more for us to be able to gain in terms of what we take from it to put in our lives. So we are looking at the Makkah period, and as you know, the seerah can be divided up into 3 periods. One is the Makkah, then there is a period of the hijrah, and then there is the Medinan period. These are, in a sense, 3 distinct periods. But even though they are distinct periods, but they are common messages and trends and approaches to how to deal with particular issues in society. And in a sense, we can say that the Makkah period is one which is very much applicable to us, in the sense that here we have Islam being nurtured in an environment where the vast majority of people living around it or associated with it were non-Muslim. In other words, Muslims were a minority. At a handful of 13 years of trying to spread the message of Islam in Makkah, there were only a handful of people, such that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to take the opportunity to look elsewhere Where else can we take this message that it can be more receptive? It can find a home where people will be able to accommodate that message. And so he sent envoys. He himself went to different places until a home was found for Islam in Medina, which is after the hijrah, and then in Medina. So we will be confining ourselves to a certain aspect of the Meccan period. Now, if it is that we were to look at the phases of the Meccan period, which is his life in Makkah, the place he was born, then we can look at it in different. We can look at life before prophethood, and I will be spending some time looking at this particular part of his life. We can look at the stage of prophethood when divine revelation was received. We can look at the first 3 years, which in a sense is called the private stage, where he was communicating the message of Islam, but it was more so to those who were around him, his family, his friends, close associates. In a sense, the message had not gone public per se, in terms of trying to reach out to the wider society. The next phase of open da'wah, when the message went to nationally, in a sense. Then we saw what happened with the establishment's challenge and response. One of strife, one of persecution. Then we saw a turning point. We saw the situation in Makkah deteriorating. Then the da'wah taken outside of Makkah, as I just mentioned. Then Ta'if, Al-Mi'raj takes place around that time. And then the opening of Medina. So I think this is where we want to end this particular 4 sessions at, inshallah. So these are some of the other phases that you'll be looking at in the forthcoming 2 weeks. So before I move on to particular stages, I want us, one, to consider who the Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alayhi wasallam was. Who was he? And the best place to be able to understand who he was is not in any book but other than the Quran. The Quran is the best source of information, the most divine and authentic source of information. We know that he was a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we know that his mission was that of trying to deliver Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's message. And this, in a sense, was a fulfillment of a prophecy which came some over 3,000 years prior to his coming into this world, where Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam made a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while he was building the Kaaba, made a dua that, Ya Allah, Rabbana, Ya Allah, O our sustainer, raise from amongst us a prophet, someone, a messenger, who will be able to come from amongst the people, who will be able to fulfill the important tasks, the task of tazkiyah, the task of purification, the task of tilawah, of recitation, the task of ta'aleem, of sharing or of teaching the message of the Quran. This was the dua that was made by Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, recorded in Surah Al-Baqarah. And then further in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers that dua. And it takes over 3,000 years for that particular dua to be answered. Which is important for us to consider. Sometimes when we make a dua, we expect immediate result. We want it there and then. We want to see it in front of us. Almost as if, we can't wait. We're in a hurry. But Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam has the foresight. He has the understanding. He plants the seed. He becomes the international da'iyah that others will become in the future. Himself trying to establish the message in Makkah, in Jerusalem, in other places as he roved from one land to the next. Having himself placed, his children placed in different places, his nephew placed in different places, all prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ibrahim, Ismail, Ishaq, Lut, all different places, and himself roving around, the true international servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in his foresight, in his vision, he realized that it was important that there continues to be people who will emanate from amongst us to be able to continue to deliver the message and show human beings the way that they ought to live. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him an uswatul hasana. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam an uswatul hasana also, the best of examples. So he was a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in being an uswatul hasana, he also becomes an ideal model. He becomes a role model for all of us to follow. Whether we are young, whether we are old, whether we are male, whether we are female, we're able to look in his life and to be able to take from his life different traits that we can use so that we can become successful both in this world and in the next world, inshallah. So that's the model. We also know that he was a human being, that he was not an angel, and he was not beyond the angels, but he was a human being who, in a sense, was so that in him we can see that we are trying to emulate somebody who is just like us, somebody who bleeds like us, somebody who thinks like us, somebody who acts like us, somebody who becomes in need of sleep, who is in need of food, who is in need of drink, who is in need of love, who can go through all sorts of psychological states of despair, states of anxiety, states of anguish, states of happiness. And these were all states that the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went through when his children died, when his children died, the young boys died. He cried. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam cried, showing the human emotion. He knew that the child was being returned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was his time to leave this world, but he cried, showing that he was just like us. He felt something within him. And there were also times when he was happy, times when he was glad, times when he was ecstatic, times when he would be laughing continuously with his companions. He would be continuously smiling with those around him. So he was a human being. And he commands the obedience. And this is important for us to consider, especially as people who want to be able to influence others. You see, as Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him a khalifa. He has made us as people, as ibadallah, as people who ought to be worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we are also khulafa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us his representatives here, his ambassadors on this earth, to be able to take forth. He are the ones that he has knighted in a sense, telling us, take forward this message of mine to the rest of humanity. We have been amongst the chosen ones. So in a sense, but being amongst the chosen ones, you want others to be able to follow you. You want to set the pace for others. But setting the pace for others just means just telling people something and hoping that they would follow. Sometimes that's something sometimes the trap we fall into. We think that our duty is simply to convey the message. So the Imam stands, we stand, maybe within our families we stand, as husbands, as wives in front of our children, and we tell them, don't you, the Quran says that you must pray, or the Quran says this, or you must do this is halal, this is haram. We look at them, we tell them in the sternest of ways, and then when they don't listen, they say, you are disobedient, you are very bad, you're disobedient. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a way, he had a mannerism such that when he spoke, others, they wanted to listen to what he had to say. And when he said something, even though it was very small, very minute, perhaps even insignificant, there were those who were ready to respond to whatever it is that he said. He had that type of effect on the Sahaba, on the companions of those around him, Muslim and non-Muslim. He had that effect. And so they were able, in a sense, to gravitate towards him, to be able to embrace that message. And these are some of the skills that it takes, that they were able to see the message of Islam is something which spreads from one heart into another heart. It is not a message which simply spreads from the tongue to the ear of another person. It is a message from one heart to another heart. And the only way a message can penetrate into the heart of someone else is first it must be somewhere that it is residing within your own heart. Within your own heart there is taqwa. Within your own heart there is ikhlas, there is true sincerity. Within your own heart there is true love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or once that is there in your own heart, then that is something that will radiate around you. And others will be able to see it, not with their eyes, but with their heart, with their qalb as well. And then the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in being somebody who spreads the message from his heart, he becomes a true rahmah, a true mercy for all of humanity. Rahmatul lil alameen. Somebody who comes and does not place burden upon others, but makes life easier for everyone else. Everyone else can see. It is not as if, someone is coming in, some sheikh is coming in and say, oh, subhanallah, what is he going to tell us to do to make life even more difficult for us today? But here the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was coming to make life easier. When he had two ways in order to do something, which way would he choose? He would choose the easier of the two ways to be able to accomplish the task. And this is something that we need to learn. And he was somebody who showed that you need to be patient in life. Life is something as you go through, there are many obstacles, there are many barriers, many hurdles. Many times you will falter. Many times you will feel, in a sense, almost to the point of depression. But you need to be patient. You need to have that sense of sabr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent His most beloved to this world. But the most beloved who came to this world was also the most beloved who had to sacrifice the most. Sacrifice with his own teeth, with his own limbs, with his own blood. He had to sacrifice to be able to spread the message, to be able to live his life as a true Muslim. And this is something we must recognize. So he trusts and he serves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all that he did. Now, taking that into consideration of who the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is, let us now look at the days of Jahiliyyah. It is important as we consider this period of time before prophethood, which came at the age of 40, that we consider the type of society in which he lived in. Now, when we consider that type of society, one of the remarkable things I see, and I'm sure most of us, when we think about it, will be able to recognize, is that there is a lot of similarity between our society and between that society. Even though it was there perhaps 1500 plus years ago. But in this society here, there is a lot which is common. So if we look at the point of view of politics at that time was based upon tribes. So you had different type of tribes. Okay, and the leaders of these tribes were the sheikh, in a sense, somebody that was there that moved from one generation to the next. And the way the tribes behaved is that the fittest were the ones that survived. In other words, the sword was a final arbiter when it came to defining or settling disputes between people. Whichever tribe was more victorious in battles, they were the tribes that eventually would succeed. This is the way that it was. In other words, it was the dominant power. And the dominant power would take advantage. So it was not a question of right and wrong. It is not a question of whether your cause is just and his cause is not just. And therefore we need to make a moral decision about what is just for what is not just. But if it is that you call yourself the superpower at that time, or the super tribe at that time, it meant that you had full control. I want you to consider our own society. What is it based on? Is it based upon morality? It is based upon justice and injustice. Is it based upon who is right and who is wrong? Who might be committing crimes and who are the recipients who are suffering as a result of it? Is that the way life is conducted here? Is that the way the media describes what happens in the world? We see that there's a dominant ideology, the dominant force, the superpower is the one that takes hold of everything that takes place. And that is very similar to what existed at the time of the Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we were to look at economics, we will see that land and resources were treated as possessions. And land and resources were things which dictated who you become. If you had land and you had resources and you had camels and things like that, then you will of course become amongst the highest of classes amongst the people. And therefore everybody else had to suffer. So you had those who were very, very rich, and then you have those who were very, very poor. You have those who own all of the land, and then you have those who worked on all of the land. Think back at our own subcontinent, places like Pakistan, where the serfdom, where the people who own the land, in a sense, controls everyone else. Controls not just those who are there, but controls generations of people. So imperialism and capitalism was rampant at that time. No different from our times. If you think about morality, we're looking at a society that was a highly immoral society. Highly immoral society. Okay, where anything goes. Intoxication, it was a sex-crazed society. People would indulge in activity with all sorts of people that they didn't know. Sometimes, maybe many women, for instance, sometimes women, they would go behind many men. And at the end of it, what happens? Who is the father? They would simply draw lots of times to decide who will take the child that emanates from these relationships. So this is the type of society that we live in. People didn't know who their fathers were, who their mothers were, what was happening to them, where they came from. And this is exactly what we see in our own time. And illiteracy, ignorance is something that was prevalent. But even though it was in a sense an illiterate society, it was also a society in which there were some good things about it as well. In that, for instance, language was something which was developed to a very high standard. The Arabic language was well developed at that time, but it was more so oral tradition. So though people could not read and write, but in terms of being able to communicate with each other, they did so through memory, to be able through stories and so forth and so on. In terms of social life, the setting we know was in the desert and so forth. So these were some of the characteristics. Now, if you will look at some of the characteristics of desert Arabs, there were some things which are good. Many things which are good, but amongst two of the most important one is called karama and karam. In other words, there were people who were within themselves, they were generally good people. They had good habits in the sense that the sense of dignity was there. The sense of pride that they had in themselves was there. The sense of nobility that they felt for each other was there. The sense of generosity that they would deliver to those around them, especially to those who came as their guests, is something that was well recognized. Even though sometimes those who asked for their protection were wrong, they would still bring them into their fold and protect them at all costs. People who committed things even against others. Wars would be fought for generations at times, just to be able to protect people who came from a particular tribe. So they did have this idea of chivalry, this idea of najda, they had within them. And these were some good characteristics which Islam was able to take. Islam was able to take all of these wholesome, good characteristics and to be able to transform it. And instead of using it for other than the deen, use it for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you think about the state of religion at that time as well, we know that the pure monastic faith of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, who had come some 3,000 years before, had all but been replaced with idolatry. And we see that. So idols, the Kaaba was filled with idols, over 360 of them. Each day that they would go around, they would make tawaf around the Kaaba. They would be worshipping other idols. Sometimes they would be able to make idols from their own food. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, the second Khalifa of Islam, he used to talk about, sometimes the Sahaba, they used to see him crying. And when they see him crying, they would say, Umar, why are you crying? And he would say, I remember the days of Jahiliyyah, or of pre-Islam, when I was a non-Muslim, of ignorance. I remember the time when I buried my daughter alive. This is it, he used to be crying. And sometimes the Sahaba used to see him laughing, and they would say, Ya Umar, why are you laughing? He said, I remember the time when I used to pray before my idol, which was in the form of food. And then I would eat it. How silly I was. I would pray to an idol, then I would eat it, and that was my God. So this is the type of religion and deen that they had at that time. But even though they were steep in such areas of idolatry, there was also something which was known as the Hanafi tradition, the Hanafiya movement, which is very much present at that time. And perhaps it can be epitomized by somebody by the name of Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl. He was somebody who resolved, he understood that amongst the idolatry there was something rotten at the core of idolatry. So he resolved to go out in search of true followers of Ibrahim. And in his journey he died. He died before the coming of the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, certainly he will be raised as a community by himself. So the tradition, the Hanafiya tradition, there were still remnants of that monotheistic faith which existed at that time. When we look back now at some of the beliefs of the Hanafi tradition which existed, one, in terms of the idea of creation and creator, they believe it was two and separate. They were two different things. Creation and creator was different. You had the creation and then you had the creator. And they were both distinct parties. The creation came from the creator, had to be worshipped. The creation has to worship the creator. If you think about the concept of Allah, the term that we use to describe the creator and the Rabb of all of the words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not a new term. It is not as if the Quran suddenly gave this name to Allah, to the Creator. But this is a term which was present before Islam. It is a term which is used not just by Muslims, even in the world today. It is also used by non-Muslims. Christians use the same term. Christian Arabs, Jewish Arabs, they would also use the same term, Allah, in their books. So he was the God of it, but the difference being is who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. What were his characteristics? So Allah, He is the Ilah. He is the Ilah of people and of nature. Absolute oneness and transcendence of Him. In terms of human beings, they believe that human beings were free and responsible vicegerents or servants or people or representatives of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In terms of good, they believe in justice, ethical values, chivalry values, eloquence, universalism, life eternal, resurrection, judgment, reward and punishment in this life and the next. And the belief in the idea of tradition, of authority which is based upon tradition. So when we look at some of these teachings of the Hanafi traditions which predated the coming of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we realize that remnants of Islam, in a sense, of this pure tradition was still there, that Islam would take forward and revive. Now, one of the things about modern society that we would note is that in terms of when do we think an occasion is important? If we look back at ourselves, and we look back at the world today, we realize that we look back at even at the United Nations, and we look back at the days which people consider to be the most important in the calendar for over decades. We realize that we always go back to some form of warfare, isn't it? All form of warfare. To the point now that when we think about time, in our time, we think about 9/11. Those who came before 9/11, perhaps they were thinking about the time I lived before or after the Second World War, or I lived before or after the First World War, or I lived before or after the era of colonialism in the subcontinent, and so forth and so on. Always some form of conflict. Human beings insist as if their life in this earth is defined by conflict. And so too was the case with the Arabs. If you look back at the Arabs, their lives is also defined by the days that they considered to be important, was also defined by conflict. And this is just a slide which shows some of the days which they considered important. And if you look at it carefully, what it shows is that they looked at it as at a point in time when tribes fought each other. What is there to celebrate? The loss of human life. What is there to celebrate when one human being finds something to be able to strike another human being and to draw blood? But this is the way that they looked at things. Such that Islam came and replaced this idea of people trying to celebrate things based upon warfare. But rather, why don't you celebrate things based upon returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So we looked at the concept of hijrah, which defines our own calendar. And our calendar is defined of when people are fleeing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they're giving up everything which is bad within themselves and trying to return. When they're sacrificing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so they're moving from one place to the next, so that they can become free servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the way that we have defined our own calendar. Now when we were to look into the pre-Nubuwwah period, I'm not going to go through some of the parts of this particular history you have already gone through. You've looked at the birth of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all the way to when he lived in the desert as a shepherd, to his first trip to Abyssinia, and then to the Fujjar Wars. And then beyond that, beyond the Fujjar Wars, which is around the age of 25 or so of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know about the Hilful Fudul, which I will go into detail. His employment by Khadija radiallahu anha, who he used to marry. The second journey to Syria, then he marries Khadija, the freeing of Zayd and adopting him as his son, helping to rebuild the Kaaba, the Hajjatul Aswad dispute, and then the call to Prophethood. So these are some of the areas which we will cover, inshallah. But before that, I just want us to look at the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as an orphan. Because him being an orphan, there are many implications and important lessons for us to draw. And among them is that the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is somebody who was able to experience deprivation, experience what it feels like to lose someone. So we can always tell ourselves, that we feel for somebody who is poor, or we feel for someone who has lost a loved one, or we feel for somebody who has lost a mother who has lost a child, or a child who has lost a parent. We can say that, we can empathize, we can sympathize. But really, do we know what it feels like? Have we been able to experience it? And the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was somebody who was able to experience these things. So in later life, when he dealt with orphans, we saw the measure of care that he would give to them. When he saw those who were deprived, we saw how much he would go out, understanding that he was just like that. And more so understanding that throughout his life, before the call to prophethood, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was continuously guiding him. He had not been called to prophethood yet. It took 40 years for that to happen. But before that period, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand was with him. Allah was guiding him. So there was a degree of independence and a sense of a degree of self-sufficiency. And then the personal influences of society is something that was withheld. so that he would not become influenced, or he would not become influenced by some of the trends that were taking place. And this is important, especially when we consider ourselves in terms of how we grow up our children, what we expose them to. There's some people who feel, well, you know what, they are going to feel that they're going to interact with the big wide world and meet everything, so why not start it from now? And this is the thinking, this is the trend of thinking when we think about what's happening in our primary schools today. In our primary schools, and for instance, sex education is being offered to children as much as low as 5. Imagine kindergarten, year 1, year 2 students being offered this type of education. Why? They need to know it from now. Because perhaps, at an earlier age, they're sort of getting influenced in some way or another. And this is the way society is thinking. What we need to know exactly how we need to address some of these concerns. And from what we learn from the life history of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is that he was being protected, continuously been protected by Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. In living in the desert, and even in living in the desert, there were occasions in the books of Seerah that we read, when at times he wanted to go to some of the big fairs that were there. But somehow or the other, events took a different turn such that he was not able to get to those environments. So we need to be able to protect our children. So even as an orphan can make a tremendous impact on society. And this is important for us. It is not because that you were born deprived. It is not because you might be born in a low socioeconomic environment. It is not because you may not have come from some family of great nobility that you cannot become somebody who will have a tremendous impact upon society. And in Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we have somebody who was poor. We have somebody who was deprived. We have somebody who did not have his parents with him as he grew up. But we have somebody who will be able to be a determining factor in changing the course of lives of humanity from his times and from all times to come. And then there are also implications in the upbringing of children. That in a sense that we should not spoil our children giving them every single thing, everything that they want. But he went through a period of deprivation. We should imbue our children with a sense of responsibility and reasonable independence and self-sufficiency. And we see this as the Rasul of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam grew up. He was somebody who worked at a very early age. He worked as a shepherd. He worked in business to be able to earn a livelihood, to be able to support his family, even though he lived in the midst of the family of Abu Talib. But Abu Talib's family was not a rich family. Even though at that time he was from amongst the leaders of the Banu Hashim at that time, it was not a rich family. They had very limited resources at their disposal. So the Rasul of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam lived in such an environment, and he was there to be able to provide that sense of self-sufficiency. And should not impress their own guidelines, but rather the guidelines of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. This is something that we need to look at. So we see that in his youthful life, there's a separation between him and the surrounding corruption of the wider society. And one of the important reasons why Arabs would take those who lived in the cities would take their children, would send their children in the care of wet nurses and have them reared in the desert, was so that they can live and they can grow in an environment that would be able to teach them these lessons of self-sufficiency, these lessons of being able to deal with hardship, the lessons of being able to deal also with learning a language which is uncorrupted, a speech which is pure, of learning pure Arabic tongue. That is why. So when they came back now, it is not something that was corrupted, a language which is corrupted. And we see the same up to now. You go to most of the Muslim world and you listen to what they have to say. And you can't understand. You can barely understand the words. You think sometimes you go to an Arab country, you want to learn Fusha. You want to learn, the pure Arab tongue. And so you go into a taxi. And then the taxi driver starts. And then you say, well, you can't understand one thing which is being said. And unfortunately, because of that, what has happened is that many people now, even those who speak Arabic, and Arabic is their mother tongue, they are unable to appreciate the Quran. The Quran has moved far from their lives. And even though the Quran has been recited to them, they can barely understand what the words are. So we need to take note of that, inshallah. Then if we consider his life as a teenager, as a young adult, we look carefully at how he was able to deal with an environment which was very much anti-Islam in a sense, an environment of ignorance. And that is the same thing that we are facing now. We are trying to live our life as Muslims. But when we go to school, or when we go to work, or when we go to places for our recreation, we are continuously encountering things which are very much against what we hold to be true, ways that we would like to practice. You go into an gym, and you look at the way people behave. You look at the sense of nudity which exists in the gym. You look at people who have no shame about what they cover or what they uncover at times. You look at people on the streets. You look at the way that they portray themselves. So in terms of social life, did not mix with corruption. The Rasulullah, despite living in that society, he would confine himself. He would not allow himself to be influenced by that level of corruption. So there was, in a sense, a partial and selective type of separation from the wider society. More of insulation and not isolation. So he was not, in a sense, trying to isolate himself from the society, but he was trying to protect himself from the evils which existed there in the society. In terms of the economics, we know that he lived his life as a shepherd. Somebody who was in the desert. Somebody who would be able to spend time. And one of the beautiful things about being a shepherd and living that type of life as a profession is that not only do you get time to spend with the sheep that is under your care, you also get time to spend with yourself. You also get time to be able to reflect. You also be able to get yourself into that private zone, that personal time. And one of the things which is happening to all of us is happening too. When we think about our lives in a sense fluctuate between two things. One is between work, and second in our family. We go to work early in the morning, we come back late at night, we spend a few hours with our family, we go to sleep, and then the cycle continues. And for those of us perhaps who have a little bit more luxury at our disposal, then we might spend some time in recreation. But between work, between our family and recreation, going to a game, going to the gym, going something else, that's the way we live our lives. And our lives have continuously been taken up. And everybody is demanding some part of our lives. Everybody wants our attention at all times. Such that now many of us have become inseparable from our mobile phones. Inseparable. We've come into the mosque. We are here to be able to spend 1 hour in learning about our deen. And yet we keep our mobile phones on. And there is a reason for this. It's because we want to remain in continuous contact, isn't it? We're afraid that perhaps if we turn it off even for 15 minutes, that the world will suddenly collapse, that disaster will take place. I was reading recently about about some business professionals who have been very successful, and one of the things that they have done so that they can take charge of their personal time is that they will find a time when they will turn off all technology. Turn off all technology. Turn it off, completely off. At that period of time, whoever wants to contact you, if it's important, if it was an important call, or if it was an important text, it will come after the end of that period of time. Or if it is that it's so important, they will call again. If you didn't respond, such that one person came back from a 2-week vacation, and he was talking about that he put on his computer and he realized that there were 700 emails waiting to be answered. So what did he do? He erased all 700. Totally. That was perhaps 2 to 3 weeks of work just to respond to the 700 emails. And what did he notice? What he noticed was that those emails that were important, when those who sent it realized that he did not respond, they simply sent it back again. So he got the most important ones. Those which were not important and remain unanswered, they probably were not important anyway. Did the world collapse? Did anything else happen? No, nothing happened. So it's important for us to start thinking about ourselves, and that the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by living that type of life, he was able to find that private time. And that private time is for him to be able to reflect upon the condition of society, his own condition, and what he should be doing to be able to transform the wider society. And this is something that we need to take control of. We have one thing, and everybody is trying to take hold of it, and that is our time. And our time has become the latest thing. If people can control our time, then they can control us. They can make us into their slaves. And in reality, what has happened to a lot of people, not just Muslims, I'm talking about the wider society, all human beings who live today, is that they have become slaves of someone else, because others have bought into their time. Others control exactly what they do or what they don't do. So in terms of economics, he lived his life as a shepherd, and he was given that important name, Al-Amin As-Sadiq, which shows that Islam starts after morality. Islam starts after sincerity. Islam takes honesty, generosity, truthfulness, giving to others, sharing with others at a higher level. That is where Islam starts. That's the beginning of our deen. That's not the end of our deen. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam possessed all of these characteristics, which were good characteristics, noble characteristics, way before he became a messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which means what? Because we are Muslims, does it mean that we can abuse the rights of others? Because we are Muslims and we walk in a particular way, does it mean that we can swear at others? Because we can say, these people are so and so, so and so. Look at me, I'm a Muslim and they are not. Islam starts beyond that. Islam wants us to be good to our neighbors, but not just good as any other neighbor would be, but be better than what anyone else is doing. And in terms of political life, we know that during that youthful period, he was also involved in the Fujjar wars. Wars in a sense that he very much detested, but he became embroiled in it. And these were wars for many reasons. These were wars fought between tribes that sometimes did not understand why they were fighting each other. They didn't understand why they were fighting, because they've been fighting for so many generations. Suddenly they lost. What was the cause about? Why were we fighting? Why did we fight last year? And we had become in such a way that they would define the time and place that they would fight. So they couldn't fight this year. Okay, well, we can't fight this year, so you know what? Next year, on January the 21st, at 4 p.m., we will meet here at this location and we will fight again. And then we will fight for this length of time, and then we will stop, and then we will come back again. Subhanallah, this is the way that they lived their life. So he was involved in the Fujjar wars, but his involvement of the wars also be able to help him to be able to get some of that military acumen, which came in quite useful and valuable in later life. So he was an arbiter in the Kaaba dispute, which showed in a sense his hikmah, his sense of wisdom, his fine judgment which he possessed, his ability to try and settle disputes without different parties feeling as though that their rights have been abused in some way. That everybody felt happy at the end of the dispute. And I'm not going to go into the dispute because I think we all know about it. And then importantly, his involvement in Hilful Fudul was somebody who came to make a journey towards Makkah, and who came for the annual pilgrimage, a Yemeni. He sold something to one from amongst the Banu Hashim, a noble from amongst the Banu Hashim. But unfortunately, he was not paid. And so this poor person here felt that he needed the aid of others. So he called upon the different tribes to be able to help him. And so they came to his assistance, and in so doing, they decided to form a pact. And the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was amongst those who were there in starting this organization. this social and political welfare organization that will be there to be able to provide good for the wider society. And what were the features of the characteristics? It was based upon, it was there to establish virtue. It was there to help the poor, to help the wayfarer, those who were coming from outside, to help those who were persecuted, to see that any persecutor was driven out of power. This was the remit of this particular organization. And the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, he said, after the coming of prophethood, that if the Hilful Fudul had existed even now, I would have been part of it. I would have been running to be able to join in such an association, which shows us that it's not just about being a member of the Islamic Society of Britain or being a member of the Islamic Society of Rochdale, as the case may be. It is about being somebody who will be able to contribute to all causes which are just. Groups and organizations which are there to be able to help the poor, to help the deprived, to help to be able to clean the place, to help to be able to provide for the rights of others. We need to be part of such association and such groups. So when we look at the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam during that period of time between 25 and 40, then we are really looking at a time now of when he becomes involved with Khadija radiallahu anha. He gets married to her. And these are some things that we want to look at, inshallah. Because in his marriage to Khadija radiallahu anha, it represents, in a sense, the prototype. Is the prototype of an ideal Muslim family. And one of the things, very often, we get caught up with one thing. The first question when we think about, the first thing we think about when we think about the wives, we think about the life, family life of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we think about how many wives did he have again? But if you think about his life, if you think about he lived beyond from the time that he got married at the age of 25 until the point of his death, the vast majority of years which went past, he was not in a polygamous relationship. He was in a relationship with one person, with Khadija radiallahu anha. So that becomes the prototype of the ideal Muslim family. The difference of age did not matter, but it was one of being able to have a common understanding. He was somebody who was independent and he was gainfully employed and he was successful at it. And even though he got married to somebody who was well off, but he also ensured that he played his part. He did not say, well look, I've gotten married into a wealthy family now, so you know what I'm going to do? I don't need to work again. I can live off her. She has so much wealth, perhaps from a family, from businesses. I can live off her. I don't need to do anything else. I can live off her, perhaps take social security as well. But this was not the case. For Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he looked at becoming somebody who was able to stand up for himself, stand up for his family, so they can see the contribution that he was making towards the establishment of towards their own success, inshallah. So he provided for his family. He was somebody who took part in all different aspects of their life. And this was the important thing. When we look back at the life of the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when we look at his life, we realize that his time was broken down into 3 parts. 3 parts for the entire 24-hour period of each day. After prophethood, 1 part was spent in giving the dawah. During the course of the day, that was his duty, that was his goal, his responsibilities. So he would be there with the Sahaba, with Ahl Safa, who were there, who resided in the mosque. Then he would be there with other parties that would be coming from different lands to talk to him. He would be trying to teach the Sahaba who did not know. He would be there leading the prayer. So he would be there involved and engaged with the community, the Muslim community and the wider community, trying to settle disputes and counseling, so forth and so on. Then beyond that, there was a period of time which he allocated towards his family. So he knew he had to spend towards his family. They all expected that. And they looked forward to that period of time each day that he would spend with them, dedicated towards them, to make sure that he fulfilled his responsibilities and rights towards them. And then the last part of his day was spent with himself and with his Lord, where he would go forth before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where he would spend time with himself, developing himself, resting, and also being able to establish that important contact between himself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, he had a perfect teacher who was there to be able to bring him the Quran and who was there to teach him the Quran. So this is the way he lived his life. So the next thing about the marriage of Khadija and Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alaihi wasallam we note is that very often we feel as it is the male who must approach the female. But in his marriage it was different. It was the opposite. She is the one who saw in him somebody who fitted the bill, somebody that she felt that had the type of qualities she wanted in a husband. And she was somebody who was divorced as well. So she knew what to expect, she knew what she wanted. She saw it in him. And so she approached him through others and so forth and so forth and so on. So the relationship between Khadija and her and him was based upon love, respect and appreciation, hard work and unprecedented loyalty, to the point that even after her death, he would always be talking about her. He would always be looking for her family, for her friends, trying to go out to them, reach out to them, because of his great love for her. So within that shows the secrets of a successful relationship. One, we know that he has khuluqul azim, a beautiful standard of character. He never took his family for granted. He always showed his best side to his family. Mutual counseling and support was there. Even though after prophethood, when his daughters were divorced, because he had to suffer. His family suffered as well because of prophethood. Others would despise them, others rejected them. His daughters were in happy relationships with their husbands, but they were also divorced. And so he had to take them under his care. He participated in the activities of his family. He showed respect for his family. And he said that the best among you is the one who does not beat or who injure in any way his family. Stability and good faith of the partners when facing difficulties and afflictions and struggling together to spread the message of the deen. And in his life, in the life of his family, his greatest supporter at his side was that of Khadija radiallahu anha, and then his children. They were always there to support him in the mission. So when we look now at the pre-Nubuwwah period, the pre-Nubuwwah period is the period now where we are coming to prophethood, according to that light. This is the period whereby you have a pure, simple, clean and uncorrupted life of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, especially the silent impact of his personality. Testimonies from his wife Khadija, his arch enemy Abu Sufyan from the Quran show that he was somebody who lived a very pure life. We know that his entire life after prophethood was one of da'wah. And during this period prior to the angel Jibreel coming to him, in a sense, there was a sense of restlessness within his soul. He spent extensive periods of time trying to fast, trying to pray in the best way that he knew how, trying to spend how it is that he can get rid of or understand better what was happening to the wider society, how it is that he can change the wider society, trying to establish contact with the one who was the creator and the sustainer of all of the worlds. So this was the period that was spent in the cave, and he would go out sometimes for extensive periods in the cave until the angel Jibreel came to him. The angel Jibreel came to him in the month of Ramadan, the 18th of Ramadan, some say it was on Yawm al-Jumu'ah, while he was observing Qiyamul Layl in the cave Hira. And amongst the peak, and the angel Jibreel comes with the first words of Surah Al-Alaq, which serves as the first words in the Quran. That Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. That read in the name of your Lord who created the human being from something which clings. Read, and your Lord is the one who is the most bounteous, who taught by the pen, who taught the human being what he did not know. Interestingly enough and importantly enough, the first thing that was shared at the very first revelation is not the first thing to pray, the first thing to stop drinking alcohol. The first thing was to remove ignorance, to read, to educate yourself, to think, to be able to reflect, to be able to examine what is happening in this wide society. And then the next important thing after the coming, and this is a man who was now puzzled, a man who was in a sense trembling, as we see in the surahs of the Quran, Surah Al-Mudaththir, a man who himself does not understand what is happening to him. And who does he go for comfort? Who does he go for comfort? He runs straight home. And he holds the arms, and he runs straight into the arms of his wife, Khadija radiallahu anha, his greatest pillar of strength. And what does she say? Does she say, well, look, you shouldn't be in that cave for so long, perhaps you should stay away from that cave. There might be jinns there, or something there, or some evil there, or spirits there, stay away, you might be getting insane, or perhaps things are happening to you. This was not her response. Her response, nay, son of my uncle, do not say that. For Allah will surely not let such a thing happen to you. For you keep good with your relations, with your relatives. You speak the truth. You keep your trust for their owners, and your manners are noble. She bore testimony to the type of character which he had. She told him that he was somebody who was pure. He was somebody who was sincere. And the Rabbul Alameen, the sustainer and the cherisher of all of the worlds, is not one who will misguide such a person. That there is truth. She was his pillar of strength at that time. Without her, we do not know what would have been our condition. But she was the one there to support him. And this is something important for us when we think about ourselves and about our families. That very often we think that others around us will be our great pillars of strength. But we need to make our families the pillars of strength. And the way to be able to do it is that we need to be continuously communicating with our families. Let them know what is happening to us. Let them know what our thoughts and what our ideas are. Share with them our burdens. Don't just keep things within ourselves. We know about the first Muslims, and inshallah some of these things will be covered in the next session, inshallah. And we would look from the era of prophethood beyond that in the next session, inshallah. We will look at some of the major aspects of the Prophet's da'wah in Makkah, which I'm not going to go into. But I just want to leave you with a few words. I want to go back to this very first slide, which I brought to your attention. And in this very first slide, I asked us all to consider three important questions. The first one was, what exactly is the seerah? If we feel that the seerah is purely a list of names, places, times, occasions, personalities, then I think we would be deprived of a greater blessing which is there for us to be able to benefit from. It is beyond that. It is not knowing whether you know the entire history, all of the names of all the generations of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It is much more than that. It is to truly appreciate who he was, the type of what was his true mission in life, what he wanted to get out of life, how was he able to live his life to the point in which, when he left this world, all of the dreams that he had for himself and for the wider society had come to fruition. This is what we should ask ourselves. If it is that we were to answer this, then when we study it, we'll be studying it with a different lens. We'll be deriving and taking benefit from it, different type of information. And then comes the important question. After we have learned all of these facts and figures about his life, what do we take and put into our lives so that he can truly become uswatul hasana, the true and the best of examples? أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله.